Our next presenter today is an author, a journalist, a TV personality, and a little thing that I thought I might mention is he worked for the British government for 21 years in the Ministry of Defense, actually running their UFO program. Okay, so just a little thing, you know. Yeah. Consequently, because of that job, the press has nicknamed him the real Fox Mulder, because that's literally what he was doing, okay? So now he is recognized worldwide as an expert, in UFOs, strange phenomenon, conspiracy theories. So today, in August of 1990, what our speaker is going to talk about is in August of 1990, two hikers in Scotland had a spectacular close encounter. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, to pay homage to the homeland, since our speaker is going to graciously talk about it. And I pathetically look for any excuse to wear the kilt, so that's why I'm wearing it. All right. Anyway, they had a spectacular close encounter with a huge diamond-shaped UFO hovering no more than 100 feet off the ground in broad daylight. They took a series of stunning photos, contacted the newspaper, but the Ministry of Defense acquired the photographs and the negatives and somehow killed the story. So for years, a poster-sized copy of one of the best pictures was hanging in the office in the Ministry of Defense, and then even that eventually disappeared. What was the mystery craft? Where did the photos go? Why were they confiscated from the Ministry of Defense and everybody else? Why was the case silenced? So anyway, our next presenter is going to tell you all about this real-life cover-up that is stranger than anything you've seen on the X-Files. So join me in welcoming Nick Pope. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for all being here to listen this afternoon. I'd like to thank everybody at Ozark Mountain Publishing for putting on this conference, which continues to be one of the premier UFO conferences in the entire world. And I believe it's my third time here. I'm very pleased to be back, and I think it's great that this conference is continuing to honor the memory of Dolores Cannon. So, what I thought I would do today is dip into the real-life X-Files. As you know, I worked for the Ministry of Defense for 21 years, 3 years of that on the UFO project, and I guess well known for talking about a number of cases such as the Rendlesham Forest incident, which I may touch on briefly today, but I'm not going to go into in any great detail, not least because John Burroughs is there, and while I have written about this case, he kind of lived it. So, do make a point of attending his presentation on Sunday. I know I will. I might mention Rendlesham a bit later in passing, but I thought that I've done a number of TV shows on that and some of the other better-known British cases, such as the Cosford incident from 1993. So I thought I would pick another case and really drill down into it. So see what you all make of that. Before I get into that, and by the way, let's just test all this. This picture of me at the Jodrell Bank radio telescope. So I'm doing my kind of, this is like the movie Contact. So I'm doing my contact moment there. And as somebody kindly pointed out, my hair looked a little darker there. The the conference organizers said, make sure you send us a recent picture. And I'm like, yeah, okay, here's a recent-ish picture. So, that's Ministry of Defense main building where I worked. Looks positively Stalin-esque in its architecture. You know, the Lubyanka or the Dream Factory, whatever you want to call it. But I worked there for 21 years, and appropriately enough, I was up on the 8th floor. Maybe they thought I should be high up as I was on the UFO project. Actually, I think I was on the other side, but that's the 8th floor. So I was in one of these 4 spines, but on the other side, and literally overlooking 10 Downing Street. I don't know if any of you remember when the IRA launched a mortar bomb attack on Downing Street, but I was actually in the building and not only heard but felt the explosion when the mortars landed. So anyway, that's where it is, in the heart of London, overlooking Downing Street. And just for a little bit of nostalgia, there is, I believe, only one photograph that survives of me actually at the UFO project in the office doing that job. And for a little bit of nostalgia, there we go. What a handsome devil. With his jet black hair and his Harry Potter glasses. And, you know, this is back in the days, you know, really before the internet and things. And I guess somebody now could probably do a kind of, like has been done, you know, the famous photo of General Ramey in the aftermath of Roswell. Well, you know, this is a real document. I kind of vaguely remember what was on it, but you know, we even had someone from MOD security in there making sure that there were no classified files, you know, that could be visible here. These are the real-life X-Files. Oh, hello. These were the real-life X-Files. MI5 did not want you to see that. These really are the real-life X-Files, and I don't know if it shows here, but green ones are confidential and pink ones are secret. Red ones are top secret, but are not in any of those cabinets. Top secret information has to be separately maintained. But I show that just, you know, as an interesting piece of history, I guess. The Ministry of Defense policy on UFOs, this is taken from one of the most interesting documents ever to have been declassified and released by the MOD. And we kind of shot ourselves in the foot by releasing it, but it was the law, we had to do it. And this document, I think, articulates the policy. Maybe not a hard cover-up, but a soft cover-up, so to speak. Our policy is to downplay the subject of UFOs and to avoid attaching undue attention or publicity to it. And the interesting story behind that document is that the United States Air Force program, Project Bluebird, really doing the same job in the US as we were doing in the UK. They contacted us way back in 1965, well before my time, obviously, and and they asked us, would we, exchange information on the UFO issue, exchange insights into policy, media handling, etc., and share perhaps some of our data. And we had some exchange of information with the US authorities on this, but this was what we told the American government was the way that we handled things. And it's kind of almost like an admission of guilt, in a sense. And that policy really survives to this day. I want to, before I go on to the main topic of my discussion, this the Calvine incident, I want to say a few more general things, I guess, and make a couple of other points which were not advertised as being part of the presentation, but that I thought I would take this opportunity to mention. The first one is directly related, and it concerns the ongoing program to declassify and release the Ministry of Defense UFO files. The UK got its Freedom of Information Act surprisingly late in the day. It was one of the election promises of Tony Blair, and when he won the general election in 1997 and came to power as UK Prime Minister, the Freedom of Information Act was one of his flagship election promises. He now, incidentally, describes it as one of his biggest regrets, but that's another story. And we won't get into questions about the Iraq war and the ongoing Iraq inquiry, but for those of you who are following that, after years of probably the most in-depth inquiry into any military operation, the Iraq inquiry is due to report this summer, and I don't know what it will say, but I have a sneaking suspicion that it will contain a few bombshells about the misuse of intelligence and other issues. But that's not the subject of my presentation, but catch me about that in the break, and perhaps we can chat. But I mention that because it's something which was only really made possible by the UK's Freedom of Information Act. Tony Blair came to power in 1997. Freedom of Information Act was enacted and came onto the statute books in the year 2000. But because it was such a culture change for all government departments, it was 2005 before it came fully into force. So, you all will probably be familiar with the Freedom of Information Act as something that you've been familiar with for decades. But for us in the UK, it really was something new. And for the Ministry of Defense in particular, an inherently secretive organization, the default position of which is to say nothing. This was, as you can imagine, a fundamental change in the way that we all did business. And we can get into some of that later. But when the Freedom of Information Act came into force, there were all sorts of predictions about what people would be interested in, journalists, members of the public. And all government departments were asked, what are the subjects on which you are going to get requests? And the Ministry of Defense said, we know exactly what we're going to get requests on. The Iraq war and the veterans asking for information about what their fathers or grandfathers did in the war. These predictions turned out to be completely wrong. The number one subject on which anyone made FOI requests to the Ministry of Defense was UFOs. And as a result of that, the Ministry of Defense decided in 2007 to proactively release these files in an ongoing, rolling program of disclosure with a small d, not a big Steve Bassett capital D, but disclosure with a small d of these files. And bearing in mind this policy of the Ministry of Defense, previously when asked about all this by journalists, the press office would say, oh, we glance briefly at these UFO reports that people send us, and we put them in a small file somewhere at the back of a cupboard, but we don't really have any interest in this, and the whole subject is of no real defense significance. No defense significance is the soundbite. Under FOI, when these documents had to be released, there was a kind of oops moment, because the Ministry of Defense said, oops, we actually have 60,000 documents on this subject. 60,000. Some of which were classified secret UK eyes only, and the occasional top secret document. Not bad. 60,000 documents. Not bad for a subject deemed to be of no defense significance. There is, I would suggest, a disconnect between that, 60,000 documents, some of them highly classified, and that. You know, the whole no defense significance line. And this was a line that for decades, we pushed proactively with not just UFO researchers and the public, but with the media, and even with the UK Parliament. So, needless to say, there are now a few members of Parliament and members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords who are a little bit aggrieved that for years they were told, no, this subject is of no defense significance, and by the way, we've got 60,000 documents on it. That process is continuing. The Ministry of Defense announced in June 2013 that the final batch of files had been released, and then, oops, sorry, we forgot some. We found some at the back of the cupboard. John Burroughs will tell you about some of that, I suspect, on Sunday, but if not, know that he is one of the people who has done more than just about anyone through his use of the British Freedom of Information Act, which is open to anyone to use. You don't have to be a Brit to use it. And John Burroughs has used it in a very focused way and is largely responsible for uncovering the fact that the MOD has 18 more files, which, if the timescale has been stuck to, should have been passed from the Ministry of Defense to the National Archives last month. And the National Archives have previously said they'll need about 9 months to prepare them for public release. So expect to see these final 18 files somewhere between now and the end of this year. The reason I say now is that, having announced that the final files were released in June 2013, it's not such a good news story for the MOD to now be saying, we've got some more. So I suspect that, unlike the previous 10 batches of files, where there was a big media fanfare and the MOD were trying to spin this as a good news story about open government and their commitment to freedom of information, I suspect that with this kind of embarrassing situation with the 18 files, I suspect that there will not be a proactive release, and the files might just be slipped out on a Friday afternoon. And I say slipped out on a Friday afternoon for a good reason. I mean, for those of you who study the mechanics of government, and for those of you, and there are a few, who have actually been part of the machinery of government in whatever department and whatever capacity. But I think it's worth making a couple of points about the way in which government, shall we say, spins things. Now, in a sense, this is no great surprise, and it's not really a crime. I mean, after all, corporations and other entities do it all the time. Charities do it. It's nothing unusual. If you have a good news story, you build it up and you try and tell that story. If you have a bad news story, you try and either kill that story or at the very least spin it in a positive way. I think it's human nature. It's kind of hardwired into us. Perhaps the most famous, or infamous, should I say, example of this from the UK, and I don't know how this played out over here in the US, but I think it's a fascinating insight, is on the day of 9/11, the senior press officer in a UK government department said, "This is a good day to bury bad news." And what was meant by that remark was all the embarrassing things that legally we have to publish, say reports that are due to Parliament, statistics that show things like bad news, like job losses and bad trade figures. You pick a day when there's a huge story, and then you put those out. Probably at 5:30 on a Friday afternoon, when a lot of the journalists have gone home or are celebrating the end of the week in the usual journalistic fashion. But I just say that for what it's worth to give you an insight, but I'm sure it won't come as a great surprise to you, but I think it's interesting to consider that in relation to the UFO phenomenon and in relation to when the government tells you anything about UFOs, they will tell it as a good news story. To demonstrate our commitment to open government and freedom of information, we are pleased today to make available to you, the public, the people, these files. Even the CIA got in on the act recently with the TV rebooting of the X-Files franchise and decided it would be a good time to send out a press release saying, look at our UFO files. Well, look at some of them. Look at the ones we want you to see. And they even did this big thing. 5 documents we think Agent Mulder would like to get his hands on. 5 documents we think Agent Scully would like to get her hands on. This is the CIA. You saw this. I'm sure you read it in the papers. It made international news. So, good example of the CIA tapping into pop culture and showing how they sort of play the media game, play the kind of internet age, 24/7 media coverage, social networking. The CIA have people doing that, media managers and social network media managers. And I think it's a fascinating side of this whole subject. That's my first little diversion. So watch out for the last Ministry of Defense UFO files coming soon. Secondly, I want to say something, I guess, about the whole John Podesta, Hillary Clinton situation, which I know many of you will be following with interest. Again, people like Steve Bassett have been talking about this, and the mainstream media are beginning to sense that there really is a story here. And there is a story here. John Podesta, with his famous tweets, saying things like, "My biggest regret, not being able to get the UFO files opened." Well, hang on a minute. John Podesta, chief of staff to President Obama, now campaign chief for Hillary Clinton, tweeting actively about UFOs, talking about Area 51. Hillary Clinton gave an interview to the Conway Daily Sun and basically said, well, you know, Bill Clinton looked at all this when he was president. He didn't find something. I'm going to take another look. Maybe it's time to put together a task force to go to Area 51 and see what's out there and open the files. Put together a task force? What kind of a statement is that? I mean, incredible in a way that the media haven't made more of this. I think they will. I think there was a story on CNN yesterday, again, about this. Make no mistake about it. The UFO issue will come up. It will come up in this election campaign. But, and I think this is the big but, we have to figure out who the candidates are going to be first. There is political capital to be made on this, and the UFO issue is a real minefield. I am actually quite surprised by the way this is playing out, I have to say. History shows us that this issue is toxic politically. The only person who can joke about it is the serving president of the United States or a former president, because they have nothing to lose. But a presidential candidate would be well advised to stay off this issue. There's nothing really to be gained from it, and there's an awful lot to be lost. Look at what happened. I don't have this video clip, but you can look it up on YouTube. A lot of you are probably familiar with it. Just Google the phrase Kucinich and UFOs. And when Dennis Kucinich was seeking the Democratic nomination, the moderator at one of the debates said, "I understand that you, when staying at Shirley MacLaine's property, you and her saw a UFO, and that you said afterwards it was deeply moving to you. Would you care to comment?" Well, he commented, and that was pretty much the end of his campaign. John Podesta is kind of dropping all these hints, you know, that if elected as president, Hillary should take another look at this. And Hillary has kind of joked about it, like I said, to the Conway Sun. But this, as I describe it, this is a real potential minefield. And the real unknown factor here, if Hillary does get the Democratic nomination, is what is Trump going to do? Specifically about this UFO question. Because I think he potentially has in his hands a very powerful weapon to go after her. We would think, all of us here, sitting in this room, well, if Hillary's going to take another look at UFOs and open some files, that's a good thing. But the way Trump will spin it is, she's a nut job. She believes all this wacko stuff about UFOs, and do we really want someone like this as our president? That, I guarantee you, is the way that Trump and his advisors would play that issue. So, at the moment, he's keeping his powder dry, A, because he doesn't know whether he's going to get the nomination, and B, he doesn't know whether he's going to be facing Clinton or Sanders. But if Trump gets the nomination, and if Hillary gets the nomination, expect him to go after her on the UFO issue. And if Trump doesn't get it, I would not be surprised if Cruz or whoever is selected by the Republicans uses this to go after Clinton, to paint her as somebody who's kind of associating with what they will try and tell you is a fringe issue and a kind of wacky issue. And yet, maybe it isn't. You know, I think the ultimate irony here might be that this blows up in the face of anyone who tries to use it as a weapon against a candidate. Because, as opinion polls show, belief in UFOs amongst the American people, belief that we're dealing with something extraterrestrial, is running at 50% or above. So this is not a fringe issue. And belief that the government isn't telling everything it knows about UFOs is running even higher than belief in UFOs themselves. So if a candidate comes forward and says, I'm going to open the files, and another candidate says, you know, I think you're a nut job, I don't think that would necessarily work. And of course, the way that John Podesta plays it is a clever way. And I've met John Podesta in 2011, and we've spoken about this issue. And he is genuinely interested. But I am sure that it will be played out as an open government and a freedom of information issue. And I'm sure you've seen, and again, if you haven't, you can look it up on YouTube, that clip of John Podesta saying we ought to open the UFO files. And he says we ought to do this, A, because it's the right thing to do, and B, because it's the law. So these are interesting times. I have not met Hillary Clinton and I have not met Bill Clinton, but I did share a stage with President Bill Clinton in 2011, again, when he was keynote speaker at the Global Competitiveness Forum in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And this is the Arab world's equivalent of the World Economic Forum at Davos. And there were political leaders from all over the world there. Bill Clinton was the keynote speaker. Tony Blair was there. Board and CEO representatives from almost every major corporation on the face of the planet, you know, from Boeing through to Disney and Google and whoever. Everyone was there. And in his keynote speech, Bill Clinton spoke about some of the latest discoveries in relation to NASA and the space program. And he speculated, really, that it would only be a matter of time, perhaps, before science answered for us that question of whether or not we are alone in the cosmos. And listen to his speech and read between the lines of it, and you will see that I think he is more on side with this than people might suppose. So it will be very interesting, and I hope you will forgive me for this diversion, but I just thought I wanted to share a few thoughts on this and perhaps put some material out there which will, you know, I hope give you something interesting to talk about over dinner. But we are undoubtedly heading for even taking the UFO issue out of it, probably the most interesting and entertaining and controversial election campaign that I can remember. You throw UFOs into the mix and the sky's the limit, if you'll excuse the pun. So let me now, before the organizers have a fit, let me actually turn to the topic of my presentation. Hey, I can go off-piste a little, as they say. The Calvine incident is one of the most fascinating UFO cases in the Ministry of Defense files. And everything that I speak about in this presentation can be verified and backed up, underpinned by the government's own documents on this, on the National Archives website in the UK. And there's even an article on my website somewhere which gives the specific file numbers and page numbers. So everything that I'm going to tell you is in the government's own files. So this is not me kind of speculating and theorizing. This is me speaking from a Ministry of Defense file which I had in my office. On August the 4th, 1990, two hikers were walking near Calvine in Scotland, which is close to the town of Pitlochry. I'm probably murdering all these Scottish pronunciations. I do apologize. And nice kill, by the way. But to their utter astonishment, they saw a huge diamond-shaped craft just hovering a couple of 100 feet above the ground over the moors. This thing was like nothing they had ever seen before in their lives, and they were fortunate enough to have with them a camera. So needless to say, they shot off six photos before the film ran out. This was, of course, before the days of cell phones and, all of that. But they shot off 6 photos, daylight photos of a UFO with the landscape in the background. And for those of you who know about imagery analysis, that's hugely important. A UFO, we've all seen lots of photos of UFOs at night. A lot of them, frankly, it's just a point of light. We've seen lots of photos of UFOs in the daytime, but sometimes it's just an object in the sky. So there's no point of reference. If you have the landscape in there, you can start to make some calculations about distance from the lens, size of the object, height above the ground, etc. There are parts of government and military and intelligence that specialize in that, and I'm going to go on and say a little about that in due course. So these photos were hugely important, and this object just hung there in the sky with no sound. Now, just think about that for a moment. Normally, if you see an aircraft, like a military jet, and if you ever encounter, I don't know how many of you have been to some of the air shows, but if you go to an air show and you see something like that, my goodness, you'll know about it. And if you ever see something like the Harrier jump jet that's capable of a vertical takeoff and landing and hovering, the power, the sound that the engines make to keep this thing hanging there, I mean, again, you don't just hear it, you feel it. And yet, there's this huge diamond-shaped object hovering pretty close to them, and there's no sound. Of course, this raises in our minds interesting questions about energy sources and propulsion systems. And again, we can get into that. There was a military jet aircraft in the background. It seemed to be, the witnesses weren't entirely sure whether it was circling the object, escorting it, trying to intercept it, or what it was doing. But there was a military jet there as well. And this is a part of the story. It showed up in one of the photos. Subsequently, and then the UFO, from this virtual hover, it just accelerated away directly upwards at incredible speed, leaving the two witnesses shell-shocked by what they'd just seen and experienced. They didn't know what to do. They thought no one will believe us, but they thought, well, we've got the pictures. And they were worried that, like, you know, you sometimes hear stories of people getting photos of UFOs and they didn't come out for some reason. So they were very, very nervous about this. They got the pictures back. Absolutely spectacular, phenomenal photos. Daylight, close up, perfect focus. UFO, there it is, right in front of you. Take it to the bank. End of debate. The smoking gun. So they contacted the Scottish Daily Record, the biggest, most mainstream newspaper in Scotland, and said, boy, have we got a story for you. They met with the journalist. The journalist, of course, wanted to see the photos, wanted to see the negatives too. They were astounded. They were writing up the story, and they thought, well, we'd better get a comment from the Ministry of Defense about this. You know, we've got this amazing picture. They've been telling us for years that this subject is of no defense significance. What will they say about this? So they went to the Ministry of Defense, and this was the year before I joined the UFO project, so I'm giving you a not guilty plea here. Or at the very least, I'm taking the fifth. But so my predecessor handled this, and obviously what was not known at the time was that defense intelligence staff was also deeply, deeply involved in this subject. And at some stage, when the Scottish Daily Record contacted the Ministry of Defense and said, we're going to run this story, and we're going to print these pictures, and we would like a comment from you about this, the Ministry of Defense said, well, that's fine, we'd be happy to offer a comment, but we need to see the photos. And we need to see the negatives as well. You can give them to us, and we'll get back to you on that. Big mistake. The Ministry of Defense ended up with the photos and the negatives, and the newspaper never got them back. And the story never ran. And even I don't know the exact whys and wherefores of precisely how the story was killed, but the story was killed. And the matter rested there for many years. And I was kind of surprised. And when the Ministry of Defense got the Freedom of Information Act, and when UFOs turned out to be the #1 subject, and people were asking me, I've been a part of this process. I mean, you've probably seen me do various BBC interviews talking about them each time a batch of these files are released. And one of the questions I was asked is, well, what are you most looking forward to seeing again? And I said, I tell you, I'm most looking forward to seeing the photo of the Calvine UFO. And all the media were like, what is that? We'd never heard of it, because the story had been killed. It's like, is that like Rendlesham or anything like that? And I said, no. And I said, it's the best UFO photo we ever had. And what's more, when I joined the UFO project, the photo, a blown up poster-sized copy of that photo, was on my office wall. My predecessor had put it there. We had a big map of the UK. You saw that photo of me. Those were the cupboards on the other side of the wall. We had a big map of the UK, and on the other side we had a window that looked over 10 Downing Street. We had on the wall a blown up, poster-sized copy of that photo. And it was a funny situation, because what would happen was that sometimes people would come in and would discuss things with us, and we dealt with other subjects too, apart from UFOs. So we had some war planning responsibilities, for example, and occasionally, senior Air Force officer, for example, would wander in and would be discussing something with us, and gradually you'd see them kind of doing this. And it's like, sorry, am I not interesting? Are you not interested in this war plan document that we're supposed to be discussing? But their eyes inevitably had been drawn to the photo, and they were going, what's that? And we said, well, you tell us. Now, when the Freedom of Information Act came out, and when the Ministry of Defense finally had to release the files from 1990, documents relating to the Calvine incident were indeed released. But the photo was missing. And remember what I said about spin, and sexing up a good news story, playing down or killing a bad news story. The MOD dealt with this in a really clever way. You've got to admire it, in a sense. They didn't release the original picture, which they said had been lost. But they cleverly found a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a very small line drawing that had been done of the photograph. And they released it. Why did they release it? They released it because it looks rubbish. Here we are. That's what they released. It's like, we've got this fantastic picture of a UFO, and here it is. So of course, what did the media say? Oh, well, listen to all that hype about UFOs, and this is the best evidence they've got. Move along, there's nothing to see. It's of no defense significance, just like we told you all those years ago. And guess what? The media fell for it. And for a long while, that was the only picture out there. somebody who had read the story, then, I don't know why I'm picking up the wrong thing. Somebody did a better version, and they kind of came up with that. That was, some graphic artist did something for media a while ago. But 2 years ago, I was contacted by Channel 5, one of the 5 main terrestrial, as opposed to extraterrestrial, UK television networks. And they said, we are putting together a program on UFOs, and we're looking for a case, not Rendlesham, because we've done that, but we're looking for a case that will be new to people. Do you have anything interesting that you think might make a good story? And I said, yeah, I've got a great story. What about the Calvine UFO? And they said, oh, yes, that's that case where there was that little diamond-shaped thing. And I said, well, that's not really the whole story. And so what they did is they flew me to LA. They teamed me up with a top graphic artist. We spent hours going through the documents, the witness statements, the testimony, then looking at the old line drawing that I showed you, and this artist's impression. But then going from my memory and sitting down and gradually building up a picture. And, I kind of felt like, I guess I was a crime victim, with one of these police artists. That was what it was like. No, the eyes are a little bit bigger, no, that's the wrong color. And we spent hours going, starting with the line drawing and batting it back and forward between us until, and I watch a lot of these true crime programs like Forensic Files and 48 Hours and things, and it's interesting. You get that. You wouldn't quite believe it until it happens, but victims say there's a single moment where the sketch kind of hits the mark, and they say, that's him. It's the that's him moment. Well, there was a that's it moment with me. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is it. This, and when when this is the product of hours of work, and when I saw it, it literally took my breath away for a moment. I was like, oh my gosh, it's like going back in time and being in that office and seeing that picture again. I mean, he was a professional, obviously, but there is that single moment where it comes into being as something real and tangible. And this is what it looked like. Now, you compare that with that silly cartoon photocopy line drawing, and you see why the Ministry of Defense decided to release the former, but mysteriously lost this. You couldn't release something like that and then say, these things are of no defense significance. If they're of no defense significance, why are we trying to intercept this thing or escorting it? And I don't know. I know the individual who took that picture down. It was taken off my office wall in 1994 while I was still working at the UFO project, and my then head of division convinced himself, because he was a skeptic about extraterrestrials, he convinced himself, he said, this can't be what we all think it might be, because I don't believe in that kind of stuff. Therefore, it must be some sort of secret prototype aircraft or drone. And having convinced himself of that, he thought, well, we ought not to be having it on display in the office wall. So he took it away. I came in one morning and I was like, hey, where's our poster gone? And my head of division said, I have taken possession of it and locked it up with the top secret documents in my combination safe, because I believe that it is a secret prototype aircraft or drone, possibly Aurora, which the US government had just told us didn't exist. And that's another story in itself, how we nearly caused a diplomatic incident with the Americans. We had a lot of sightings of triangular and diamond-shaped UFOs, quite a lot of them in Scotland. And because we wanted to obviously find out whether there was some spy plane or drone, we asked intelligence, well, what do we have and what do other countries have, whether they be allies or enemies or just neutral. We said, what's out there? What is the state of the art when it comes to spy planes and drones? And of course the answer, as I'm sure you all know, is that aviation technology generally runs 10, possibly 15 years ahead of what's publicly declared, what you'll see on the news, what you'll see rolled out at the air shows and the trade fairs. So we've got a pretty good idea at any time what's out there. And we didn't think this was a spy plane or a drone. But my head of division did, because he didn't really have anywhere else to go with his personal belief system. And then he retired, and then when the MOD declassified the files and they opened up the safe, well, that picture had gone missing. I suspect it went through the shredder, but I know, or at least I strongly suspect, there were other copies. Hell, I'd seen several copies. One time, just to give you, again, I want to give you a bit of flavor, a bit of color about what it was like working on these real-life X-Files. One time, my boss and I went to an intelligence briefing on UFOs. And we sat through the brief, and at the end, the briefer pulled out his copy of this photo. You know, it's like everyone had one. And he said, take that photo, for example. And he was sitting opposite us, and he said, we know it's not the Americans. We know it's not the Russians. And that only leaves... And he didn't say anything. And my boss looked at me, and I looked at my boss, and we looked at his finger, and we all looked up at the ceiling, and nothing further was said about it. It's kind of an unwritten rule that we never used words like alien or extraterrestrial. It was like we can't bring ourselves to even articulate it as a possibility. So there I was in this intelligence briefing, and the closest it was ever gotten to was, and that only leaves. He did say one other thing. He kept referring to these people. Now, I've heard a lot of slang phrases for extraterrestrials over the years. If you talk to people who've done this at governmental level, you'll hear that they've kind of got nicknames for them. I've heard them referred to as the visitors. I've heard them referred to as the kids. It's like every government UFO project seems to have their slang. Ours was these people, a very British saying. These people, they come over here. It's a sort of almost, it's not quite, they take our jobs, they Actually, I mentioned Donald Trump earlier. I hate to think what he'll have to say about illegal aliens, but, we want to build a wall and we want to keep these gray out of this place. Anyway. But we Brits used the phrase, these people. It was like, we'd like to know about these people's propulsion system, their energy source. If that was just hanging there, making no sound, what can that teach us about science and technology that we don't currently have? And make no mistake about it, technology acquisition is at the heart of government secrecy about UFOs, because the first government, or dare I say corporation, on the face of the planet to get their hands on that technology is going to be the dominant force on this planet for the foreseeable future. High stakes? Absolutely. Justification for secrecy? You bet. So these people, and my boss and I kind of walked back across the road, and my boss said to me, "Interesting briefing, Nick." I said, "Yeah, boss." And he said, just one thing I didn't understand. Who are these people? And I said, if you wanted to know, you should have asked, boss. So this photo, I hope the original will turn up. But one of the reasons we were so excited about it is, anyone can fake a photo. It was probably harder back in those days than it is now, but it could be done. You could do a double exposure. You could build a model and throw something in the air. But the Ministry of Defense has expertise in this area. At the time I was doing the job, it was called JARIC, Joint Aerial Reconnaissance and Intelligence Centre. And JARIC was the UK's centre of excellence in the military and the intelligence community when it came to imagery analysis. Their normal bread and butter day-to-day business was looking at satellite photos of missile sites and looking at photos taken from spy planes of the latest Soviet or Warsaw Pact missile cruiser or whatever. But they looked at our UFO photos and videos too. And when you've got military intelligence imagery analysts on the case, you can guarantee that you're going to get a pretty sophisticated and savvy analysis. And the headline conclusions of this photo, and obviously this is a reconstruction, but it is as near as I can get to my memory of the real thing. The headline findings of JARIC were that this is not a fake, it's not a hoaxed picture, it is a real object. It's pretty big. I think they said upwards of 25 meters in diameter. And we sure as heck would like to get our hands on it, because it clearly has a technology that we can only wish for. Now, after this TV program, there was some mainstream media coverage of this, and I write fairly regularly for The Sun, which is the UK's best-selling national daily newspaper. And we put this in the center spread one day. And there it is, obviously. It's the lead story there. Now, The Sun is a tabloid, but it is the best-selling national daily newspaper in the United Kingdom. And just think about that for a moment in terms of, in the United States, I guess the aspiration with this subject would be to get it into the Post or the Times, say. Well, you know, getting a pro-UFO story like this in 2 pages in the biggest newspaper in the UK is an important part of the process. And again, my aim in doing that was to try and ensure that this story was not lost, that this story continues to be told, that the hikers come forward after all these years. I can't remember their names, I'm afraid to say, and even if I could, I would probably not be allowed to mention them because I would be breaking the law in terms of data protection. It's up to them to come forward. It's not for me to out them, but we've made every effort to try and encourage them to come forward and to try to encourage some of the people who were involved at the newspaper at the time, and even some of the retired intelligence folks, maybe to say, how did you do it? How did you kill that story? And by the way, can we have the original photos and negatives if they exist? So with modern technology, we can kick this over the line and write the final chapter on this. Now, I have embedded a small video in this, and I'm not sure whether it will come out or not, so I'm going to have a go. But this is from this Channel 5 documentary that I mentioned, and I think it was just called Conspiracies. It was part of a series called Conspiracies, and this was their UFO program. And I don't know how this will work. Maybe I can try this. Here we go. Let's see if this will work.
According to the UFO files, in August 1990, 2 hikers were walking in the Scottish Highlands, close to Calvine, north of Pitlochry. Suddenly, they saw something incredible. It was a chance for the picture of a lifetime. The hikers immediately contacted journalists from the Scottish Daily Record newspaper. After viewing their photos, the journalists chose to share both pictures and negatives with the Ministry of Defence. The UFO desk files say that the images were then analysed by the best team in the business.
The Defence Intelligence Staff sent these images to JARIC, that's the Joint Air Reconnaissance and Intelligence Centre. Now, this is the UK's military centre of expertise when it comes to imagery analysis.
They identified a small jet in the background, but the large diamond-shaped craft in the foreground defied classification.
These intelligence personnel come to the conclusion that these photographs are real, it's a solid craft, and no one has the faintest idea what it is.
At the time, Nick Pope was a junior member of the UFO team. He remembers the response of the MOD's top UFO expert.
He started gesticulating, and he said, well, we know it's not the Americans, and he pointed his finger that way, and he flipped it the other way and said, it's not the Russians. And he said, and that only leaves, and he did that. And my boss looked at his finger and looked up at the ceiling, and we all just looked at each other, and nothing further was said.
I think I'm wearing the same outfit, actually. I do have more than one shirt. Producers like green. Anyway. Again, getting that information out onto one of the 5 big TV networks in the UK is an important part of taking this forward. They got a couple of things wrong in that. The first thing was, for some reason, they had the UFO fly off horizontally, whereas in fact, the witnesses said that it was actually vertical. And the other thing is, I wasn't junior. I don't know where they got this junior member. Anyway, I will try not to be rank conscious about Channel 5 demoting me. Diamond-shaped UFOs are not the usual shape one hears about, but they do come up from time to time. One, I guess it all depends on your angle of observation, of course, but one possible similarity is from the Cash Landrum encounter in December 1980. And incidentally, the Cash Landrum encounter took place literally only hours after the Rendlesham Forest UFO encounter. One in the county of Suffolk in England, one here in the United States. Is there a connection? I don't know. But it's an interesting example of a diamond-shaped UFO, and it's also one of only a handful of cases where it's alleged that military aircraft, in this case Chinooks, were escorting or maybe even trying to intercept an object. Does this mean that it is an interception attempt? Well, you know, if I was going to intercept a UFO, I might send a Harrier, but I probably wouldn't send Chinooks. So is it being escorted? And if it's been escorted, does that mean it is one of ours? Or does it mean that there is what I think some people sometimes refer to as a joint enterprise? You know, that it's us and these people. These people who cannot be named. Because even we in government don't want to appear like we've lost the plot. Which is why, for example, we generally changed the terminology and used UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, as opposed to UFO. It's all about the words you use, the language you use. So yes, a joint venture with these people, who knows? But Cash Landrum is one of the interesting cases, and I always, in all of my government work, a lot of what I was trying to do was look for connections between sightings, join the dots. It's all very well investigating on a case-by-case basis, and since 1953, when the MOD's UFO project was started, at least formally, until it was wound up, allegedly, as a victim of a wider round of defense cuts in 2009, the MOD investigated around 12,000 UFO cases. You know, in all of that, these are our flagship cases. But what we wanted to do was not investigate them on a case-by-case basis, but put the whole picture together and do a proper intelligence analysis and say, what does this mean? What are we dealing with here? And what are the implications, not just in terms of defense and national security, but for science, for technology? What are the societal level consequences of all of this? That's another story. I promised not to mention too much about Rendlesham, but just to give, I suppose, a sense of the shape of UFOs. Again, one sees the diamond shape of the Calvine UFO. One sees this diamond shape with the Cash Landrum. There is one of Jim Penniston's sketches of the Rendlesham UFO. And just in case anyone is, there's a blurry line, I think, with fact and fiction. I've done this little joke before. It's so some of you may know this, but does anyone know what sci-fi movie that's from? Okay, it's not from a sci-fi movie. It is a real craft. I kind of gave it away there, putting Tyrannus up. I'm pleased to say it's actually British. Britannia may not rule the waves anymore, but by golly, maybe we rule the skies still. If we're putting out things like this is, I guess you'd call it a drone. UCAS is I think the technical term for it, an unmanned combat air system. It's called Tyrannus. This is a prototype. Rolled out a couple of years. This photo I took off the Ministry of Defense website. This is, I'm not whistleblowing here. This is the sort of stuff that's out there, and you've got to ask yourself, if this is the sort of stuff that's out there, what have we got that they're not telling you about? And where did we get that? For those of you who want to go down that road, how did we suddenly get to be able to build something like that? And doesn't it look, for all the world, like every sci-fi cliche image of a spaceship in a hangar? And that is the Ministry of Defense and BAE Systems rolling this out at a press event for the world's media. Are they trying to tell us something? Somebody laying a trail of breadcrumbs and saying that the answers are already out there if only you know how to look, and if only you see with fresh eyes. And I don't know when this will go operational. And for those of you who are interested in the technology of this, it will be remotely piloted. It will have a degree of autonomy, but it will not, I don't think it's going to go down the road to self-selection of targets. For those of you who are sci-fi fans, it's probably not an idea to build your AI too smart. The Ministry of Defense, this is an absolutely true story. Ministry of Defense designed a communication system of satellites and integrated networks tied into everything. And guess what we called it? Skynet. Probably not that smart. What shall we do to Skynet? Let's turn over control to it. Let's not go down that road. So that's Tyrannus, named after the Celtic god of thunder. I mean, apologies to all of you who maybe take a more spiritual and New Age view of the UFO phenomenon, and I absolutely respect that, but I'm just telling you it the way it is. And obviously, if you put the Ministry of Defense onto the UFO issue, this is what you get. You get that kind of mindset, you get that mentality. It's interesting that almost every country that has ever had a UFO project has embedded that project in its DOD or in its Air Force. The one exception actually are the French. They embed it in their National Space Center. Possibly a smarter, better way of doing it. Maybe you get a different mindset, you get a different result. But that's, I think, a debate for another day. And I've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap up in a minute. But named, as I say, after the Celtic god of thunder. You know, sad to say, with the Ministry of Defense, there is obviously its defense, its military, its war fighting. So when you look at Ministry of Defense intelligence studies on UFOs, and I know that John Burroughs is going to talk about one of those, Project Condign, on Sunday morning, you find that, you know, technology acquisition and weaponization lie at the heart of the interest and lie at the heart of the secrecy. There is, I'm afraid to say, for those of you who've seen that wonderful Richard Burton movie, The Medusa Touch, but that classic quote, I think, encapsulates it so well when he says, "We find out what powers the sun, and we make bombs out of it." And that is, I think, a very perceptive line about human nature. I'll show you one last image, just to show you the way things are going. Tyrannus is now almost old technology, even though it's not, so far as I know, fully operational yet. But as ever, people are working on building even better ones. And again, just to show you a final picture taken from the Ministry of Defense website, showing you the sorts of things that are being developed, the sorts of technologies that are either here or they're coming. That's the one that's going to replace Tyrannus. It's an Anglo-French initiative. Again, unmanned combat air system designed to unleash hell upon the bad guys. In a sense, I apologize for ending on what many of you might see as a negative note. But I guess the key point that I'm making in all of this is that whether we're talking about the Calvine incident and that amazing technology, or we're talking about the amazing technologies that governments are working on right now, this, as I say, this is taken from the Ministry of Defense website. It's not taken, as you might suppose, from a Star Trek fan magazine. And I think sometimes we don't know quite where the line is between science fiction and science fact. But what I would say is I think that line is thinner than we might suppose. So on that note, I will close, and thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.